You're probably familiar with the traditional style of overlay mosaic crochet where you have all kinds of ends in your project at the beginning and the end of every row. You can either weave in those ends, make them into fringe, or cover them with a double border. But that's a lot of work, isn't it? What if you could do the same kind of project in overlay mosaic crochet with all right-sided rows and you didn't have all those ends? That would be a game changer, wouldn't it? Join me in this video where I'll teach you my revolutionary new technique that I call continuous overlay mosaic crochet to eliminate all those pesky ends. So let's get started. I first developed my technique for continuous overlay mosaic crochet back in 2018. Wow, that's a mouthful, isn't it? Continuous overlay mosaic crochet. Let's just call it COM for short. Anyway, back in 2018, I was crocheting some swatches.
Swatches? Swatches? We don't need no stinking swatches.
But seriously. Soon after I crocheted that swatch, I designed a mosaic blanket using this technique. And I've designed another one recently as well. But I knew I didn't want to keep this technique all to myself, so that's why I'm sharing it with you today. Now you'll have an option for working your overlay mosaic crochet projects with virtually no ends to weave in. Now before I proceed, I want to let you know that my new COM technique is only good for overlay mosaic crochet. It doesn't work for inset mosaic crochet. These are all the ends that we have at the beginning and the end of our rows on overlay mosaic. And all of these rows are worked on the right side. With the inset, you're working 2 rows of each color, so you're just carrying your yarn up one edge, and you don't end up with all those ends. I also want to let you know that my COM technique uses a little bit more yarn. Just how much more depends on the project that you're making. And I'll go over this in more detail further on in the video. In my opinion, the time saved by having virtually no ends to weave in far outweighs the extra yarn that's used. In fact, I only had 30 ends to weave in total on my newest mosaic blanket, which would have had over 250 yarn ends to weave in if I had not been using my COM technique. These are my 2 overlay mosaic crochet patterns that I've just released using my COM technique. Each of these patterns already has the extra yardage added to the materials list, so you don't need to figure out the extra yardage. The pattern on the left is my Dueling Diamonds blanket, the one that I only had 30 ends to weave in at the end of the project, and the one on the right is my Wedding Ring blanket. If you don't already know how to do regular overlay mosaic crochet, check out my Overlay Mosaic Crochet tutorial. The link to that video is in the description below. So let's take a look at my continuous overlay mosaic crochet technique now, which is also known as COM. Here I have a swatch of my continuous overlay mosaic crochet, or COM for short. You can see that there's just 2 ends for each of the 2 colors used, not 2 ends for each of the rows. So let me show you how to do this. Here I've started a mosaic crochet piece in overlay mosaic crochet, and I have finished all the stitches in row 1. And this was the loop that was left on my hook at the end of my last stitch. What I'm going to do for this continuous method, instead of cutting this off, I'm going to pull this loop up much larger until it's big enough to put my yarn through. And I'm going to take my ball of yarn and put it through the loop from the back to the front, and then I'm going to tighten up the loop. And I pull that loop and that yarn until it's tight. And this is how we're going to not have to cut our yarn, but lay it across to the beginning so it's ready the next time we need it. And I'm going to demonstrate row 2, how to work over the yarn. We're going to start row 2 with a slip knot, and then we will start, as we usually do in Overlay Mosaic Crochet, with a single crochet in the back loop of the first stitch, and we always have our right side facing still. But we're also going to work over the yarn that we're carrying across. So we'll work a single crochet in that back loop, and now our yarn is covered with our stitch, and we're going to cover our yarn or encase our yarn in each stitch across the row. So row 2 is nothing but single crochet in the back loop of each stitch across, encasing that carried yarn as we go. And I'll work the rest of these single crochets in row 2, and I will meet you at the end. Okay, here I am at the end of row 2, and I've worked all my stitches across. Here's my loop that's on the hook, and I'm going to elongate that loop and make it nice and big so that I can pass my big skein of yarn through it from the back to the front. Now, sometimes you have a ball of yarn, sometimes you have a skein of yarn, sometimes you have a cake of yarn, but you can make that loop as big as you need it in order to put the yarn through it. And then you'll just tighten that up. You can adjust your last single crochet at the same time, so if it was a little too tall, you can make it a little shorter. And you want to get that nice and tight there. So we have just done rows 1 and 2, and we've encased the yarn from the end of row 2 going all the way across to the beginning. So now we can lay row 2 yarn across and work row 3 stitches across over this yarn. But before we do that, every time we finish a row in this comb technique, and before we start the next row, we need to adjust that carried yarn. So you want to make sure that that's not too tight or too loose. So I'll give it a little tug, and I'll also give my row a little tug, so it's not too tight or too loose. And now we're ready to start row 3. So we'll get our yarns in the right place here. This is just our tail. We want it out of the way. And we're going to work with our dark color again, encasing our light color that we're carrying across. Now I'm going to start the mosaic pattern now, and I'm going to use just my regular mosaic swatch chart, and you can download this from my website if you'd like. The link is in the video description below, so you can practice this comb technique. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to join with an anchored double crochet. And the anchored double crochet is very important to use with this technique because you want to encase this carried yarn. If you don't use the anchored double crochet, you won't be encasing the yarn with your double crochet stitches. So in order to start, we don't have a loop on the hook, do we? We're going to go ahead and insert our hook under the front and back loop of the first stitch. I always work my anchored double crochet under both front and back loop at the beginning. And we'll yarn over with our other color and pull it through, and we're going to chain 1 for the height of our stitch. And we haven't done our stitch yet, but now we have our dark yarn ready for our first stitch of the row. And our anchored double crochet will be worked under the front and back loops of the stitch, encasing our carried yarn. Pull up a loop, and then the double crochet portion is yarn over, insert the hook from the bottom to the top in the front loop of the stitch right below, in the row below, and pull up a loop. We have 4 loops on the hook. Yarn over and pull through the first 2 loops, and yarn over and pull through the last 3 loops. And that's how to join with an anchored double crochet at the beginning of the row. The next stitch will be a single crochet in the back loop, and we're still working over our carried yarn. We can adjust it from either end as we're working, and we want to make sure we adjust it before we start our next row. And here's a regular anchored double crochet working over our carried yarn, and we'll just work that as usual. I have another video showing the anchored double crochet several times, so if you'd like to watch that, I have a link in the video description below. And we are just going to work each of our stitches according to our chart all the way across to the end, and I will meet you when I get to this end. Okay, here I am at the end of row 3, and my last stitch is another anchored double crochet. And I always want to work that under both loops of that stitch, and in the front loop of the stitch in the row below. So we work that last anchored double crochet, and instead of fastening off, we're going to take our yarn, make our loop big, and I like to make sure that the loop is still facing me. I don't want it to be twisting around, and put my yarn through from the back to the front, right through that loop, and tighten it up. And then we're ready to start our next row. And look at this. The next color is right there waiting for us. Now before we start that row, we want to adjust this again. So we'll hold on here, and we'll just give a gentle tug, and we'll adjust the width here. Now this is really important if you're doing an afghan that's, say, 30 to 40 or 50 inches wide. You really want to make sure that that carried yarn isn't too tight or too loose under there. If it's too loose, you'll have little knobbies sticking out from the color that's being carried. And if it's too tight, your project is going to start getting narrower and narrower. So adjusting that yarn is really important. So now we're ready to start row 4. And row 4 starts with a single crochet. As you can see on the chart, it starts with a regular single crochet, but we're going to work that in the back loop. So all we're going to do is insert our hook in the back loop of that first stitch, get our yarn, which is behind our carried yarn, and pull up a loop and chain 1. And that chain 1 actually encases that carried yarn before we even do our single crochet. So this is our chain 1 that we would normally have on a single crochet row. And now we'll do our single crochet in that back loop. And we would continue across the row, working all the stitches on our chart, and taking our last loop and making it longer and passing our ball of yarn through it. And that's what you do on every row of this continuous mosaic crochet. So now that you know how to work the COM technique, there's a few things I'd like to share with you. When you're doing this technique, you can only work on one row at a time because you're carrying that yarn across to the beginning of the next row of that color. I know a lot of people have said that they start their rows and they're working a lot of different rows at a time. Well, you can't do that with this technique. You're only working one row at a time. Now, before you finish off your row and put your yarn through your loop, you want to check your row and make sure you don't have any mistakes. If you find a mistake after you've done that and you need to go back, let me show you how to do that. You can rip out what you've got, but you can't rip this out right now. What you need to do is elongate your loop, just like you did before, but it's a little bit more tricky now. Not too much, but just a little bit. And you need to take your yarn and put it back through the loop, but from the front to the back now instead of the back to the front. And then you can actually rip out your stitches and go back to where your mistake was and correct that. Now, another thing to remember when you're working in the comb technique is that this is going to use a little bit more yarn. If you're using another pattern, which is not my pattern, which does not already have this included in the yardage, you're going to need to figure it out. So what you want to do is, with the pattern that you're going to work on, you need to know the width of your rows, and you need to know how many rows you're working in each of the colors. So you're going to multiply the width of that row by the number of rows in that color to give you the extra yardage requirements for that Overlay Mosaic Crochet pattern. I hope you followed along and you successfully learned my continuous Overlay Mosaic Crochet technique, so you can eliminate all those pesky ends in your mosaic crochet projects. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comments section below. If you've been successful with doing my continuous Overlay Mosaic Crochet technique, or COM for short, please let me know. I love to hear your success stories. If you'd like to make one of my Overlay Mosaic Crochet blankets, check the video description below for a link to those patterns. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more of my crochet videos, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks so much for watching, and happy continuous Overlay Mosaic Crocheting to all of you. Join me in this video and I'll teach you a Join me in this video and I'll teach you my even revolutionary is a big word.